Listen, I want to talk to you today about something that affects almost everyone, but hardly anyone truly understands. I'm talking about those moments when your mind just drifts away, when you're supposed to be working or studying, but suddenly you realize you've been staring at the same page for 10 minutes without absorbing a single word. Most people treat this as a failure, as something wrong with them that needs to be fixed immediately. Here's what you need to grasp right from the start when your mind wanders off like this. It's not broken. It's actually trying to help you. Your brain is attempting to restore its own cognitive capacity to recharge itself so you can function better. Understanding this completely changes how we should approach the whole situation. Everyone experiences this mental drift. It doesn't matter who you are or what you do. It happens when you're exhausted, when you're feeling overwhelmed by everything on your plate, or when you're just plain bored with what's in front of you. Think about it this way. Imagine you're preparing for an important exam and you've been studying intensely for hours. Your mind feels foggy, your thoughts are sluggish, you find yourself staring out the window for a while. When you finally bring your attention back to your books, you often feel like you can actually think more clearly again. That's not a coincidence. The real issue isn't that this happens. The problem is that many people get caught in a loop where they keep drifting away and snapping back in a pattern that becomes incredibly unproductive and frustrating. I want to share something I discovered while working with someone who came to see me with a puzzling complaint. This person had been diagnosed with attention difficulties years ago, but they told me something that initially didn't make any sense. They said their attention problems were getting progressively worse over time. Now, you might think that sounds perfectly normal. Lots of things get worse as we age, right? But here's the thing, attention deficit issues shouldn't work that way at all. Let me explain why this is so unusual. These kinds of attention challenges are what we call neurodevelopmental conditions. That means they're related to how the brain actually develops and forms its connections during childhood and adolescence. When you look at how these conditions typically progress throughout someone's life, the pattern is pretty consistent. A person's brain develops along a particular pathway. They might have mild difficulties, moderate ones, or more severe challenges. But as time goes on, and as people mature into adulthood, these issues should actually improve, not worsen. Research shows us that roughly 20% of people who are diagnosed with these attention difficulties as children will actually grow out of them completely as their brains mature. Their neural pathways develop compensatory mechanisms, and the symptoms fade away. This person sat in my office and told me their symptoms were intensifying year after year. It immediately struck me as strange. These conditions are fundamentally about how the brain is wired, about the underlying neural architecture. Based on everything we know, they should be staying relatively stable or getting better, not deteriorating. Now, there are definitely things that can temporarily affect attention. If you haven't been sleeping well, if you just went through a painful breakup, if you're dealing with significant stress at work or home, sure, you might notice your attention is worse for a while. These are temporary fluctuations. But what this person was describing wasn't temporary ups and downs. They were describing a clear downward trajectory, a consistent worsening over months and years. That shouldn't happen with this kind of neurodevelopmental condition. As I started working with this individual, we tried some conventional approaches first. We adjusted their medication, increasing the dosage to see if that would help. And yes, the increased medication did help them focus better on any given day. But here's what bothered me. Even if the medication allowed them to concentrate better today, it didn't explain why their ability to focus had been declining over such a long period. Medication can help manage symptoms, but it doesn't explain a progressive worsening of an underlying condition that should be stable. That's when I realized we needed to think differently about what was happening. We needed to look beyond the standard treatment approaches and really dig into what was going on beneath the surface. That's when I started exploring this concept of mental wandering more deeply. And let me tell you, if you're interested in solutions that go beyond the typical advice you hear everywhere, the kind of approaches that actually work in practice, even if they're not always part of the standard playbook, what I'm about to share could really help you. So, as I was trying to piece together what was happening with this person, I came across some fascinating research about something called restoration theory for attention. There were these researchers, I believe their last name was Kaplan, who made an interesting observation about what happens to our minds when we spend time in natural environments. They noticed that when people go out into nature, away from the constant demands and stimulation of modern life, tend to let their minds wander more freely. As they investigated this phenomenon more deeply, they uncovered some really important insights. First, they found that when our minds drift away from focused tasks, it actually seems to restore some of our cognitive functioning. Remember that example I gave earlier about studying for an exam? When you've been intensely focused for a long time and you take a mental break, even an involuntary one, you often come back to the task with renewed ability to concentrate. That's restoration in action. The second thing these researchers discovered was even more interesting. They found that when our minds wander, we're not just resting. We're actually working on unresolved issues in our lives. The more unfinished business we're carrying around inside us, the more frequently our minds will drift away from external tasks. You've probably experienced this in a really noticeable way at some point. Think about a time when you went through a breakup or when there was some social conflict happening in your life, when someone said something that really hurt you. In those periods, when you try to sit down and focus on work or study, your mind keeps pulling away, doesn't it? You find yourself thinking about the situation, replaying conversations, imagining different outcomes, trying to make sense of your feelings. Your brain essentially commandeers your attention and redirects it toward solving these personal problems. That's how we discovered what mental wandering is really for. It serves these two essential functions. Now, I should mention that some aspects of this restoration theory have been challenged by later research. Everything in the original theory held up under closer scrutiny. The subsequent studies have consistently confirmed these two core elements. Mental wandering is a way for our brains to recover cognitive resources like freeing up RAM in a computer. Think of it like a timeout in sports. If you're playing basketball and your team calls a timeout, you need those couple of minutes to catch your breath. Your muscles recover a little. When you go back on the court, you're able to play more effectively. Mental wandering works similarly for cognitive resources. The second finding that has held up really well is that when our minds wander, we're typically processing internal emotional material. When I was working with the person I mentioned earlier, this framework completely changed how we approached their situation. We stopped treating the mental wandering as simply a problem to be eliminated. Instead, we tried to understand that when their mind drifted away, it was attempting to accomplish specific tasks. It was trying to restore cognitive energy and process emotional material. Insight was that the more we could accomplish those tasks deliberately and efficiently outside of this passive drifting process, the better off they would be. Because here's what was actually happening. They were getting trapped in a cycle of constant mental wandering. The way this works is a bit complex, but let me walk you through it because understanding this mechanism is crucial. Your mind keeps a running inventory of all the tasks you need to complete. That's how it's able to remind you that you need to do something. It's constantly tracking your obligations and concerns. But there's a fundamental problem with this system. The more things your mind is actively tracking at any given moment, the less cognitive capacity you have available to actually work on any single problem. Your working memory gets cluttered. Here's what was happening with the person I was working with, and this might really resonate with your own experience. Let's say they were juggling 5 different tasks at once. 4 of them were obvious work-related tasks. But the 5th one was personal, and they didn't even consciously think of it as a task they were trying to solve. About a month earlier, they had separated from their partner. Not a complete breakup, but a separation. They were taking time apart to figure things out, and they were sitting in this incredibly uncomfortable state of uncertainty. They didn't know if they should be moving on with their life, if they should be waiting patiently, if they should be reaching out, or what they should be doing. This uncertainty was constantly running in the background of their mind. So here's how their typical work session would unfold. They would sit down to focus on task number 1. They'd work on it for a while, but because their mind was carrying all this background load, all these other tracked items, they would get mentally tired pretty quickly. Their mind would then switch to task number 2. They'd work on that for a bit, but again, fatigue would set in because of all the cognitive overhead. Their mind would jump to task number 3, same pattern. They'd work for a little while, get tired, and switch to task number 4. As they cycled through these different tasks, trying to make progress on each one, those thoughts about the separation kept bubbling up. Thoughts about their partner, about the relationship, about what it all meant, about what they should do, existed in this state where even if they spent a full hour at their desk, actively trying to work, they didn't actually complete anything meaningful. Their attention was too fragmented. This is when we discovered something really important. There were a couple of pieces of advice that had become incredibly popular in productivity circles, things they had heard again and again from podcasts and books and articles. These principles seemed helpful on the surface, but for them, they were actually making things worse. The first piece of advice was this mantra about just getting started. You've probably heard it 1,000 times. People say that the most important thing is just to begin. Just get started. Once you start, momentum will carry you forward. Just take that first step. The second related piece of advice was to take small steps. Break everything down into tiny pieces. Don't overwhelm yourself. Just take small steps, one after another, and eventually you'll reach your goal. But here's what we actually found for someone caught in this cycle of mental wandering. Just getting started and just taking small steps created a terrible pattern. They would take a few small steps on one task, their mind would drift, and they'd switch to another task and take a few small steps there, then drift again and take a few small steps on a third task. They would spend an entire hour just getting started over and over and over. They do a tiny piece of this, a tiny piece of that, a tiny piece of something else. And at the end of that hour, they had no completed tasks. Nothing was finished. Nothing was off their mental tracking list. In fact, they now had even more open loops because they'd started multiple things without finishing any of them. And there's actually research that supports what we observed. Studies on multitasking show something counterintuitive. People who multitask frequently, who have lots of practice switching between tasks, actually become less productive, not more. The more experienced you are at juggling multiple things, the worse you get at actually accomplishing anything substantial. Your brain becomes trained to switch constantly rather than to sustain focus and complete things. The solution we developed together was based on targeting the underlying mechanisms we'd identified. We needed to work with how the mind actually functions rather than against it. The key insight was this: if your hands are full of things you're holding, you don't have free hands to actually pick something up and work with it. Similarly, if your mind is full of tasks it's tracking, you don't have working memory available to make real progress. We also needed to recognize that when you become mentally fatigued from carrying all this cognitive load, your mind has to switch tasks more frequently just to restore its attention capacity. And crucially, we needed to acknowledge that underlying emotional issues, personal concerns, things that require self-reflection, these will demand more and more of your attention through mental wandering. The more self-reflection you need to do, more your brain will pull you away from external tasks because it's desperately trying to process that internal material. Based on all of this understanding, we came up with some approaches that might seem unusual, but have worked remarkably well. I've now used these with multiple people, and I've applied them in my own life with great results. The first principle is this: if you're stuck in a cycle where mental wandering has trapped you, stop focusing on just getting started. Your mind is going to wander anyway if you just get started on multiple things. Instead, focus completely on task completion. Finish things. Get them off your list. Close the loop. Now, I know this might sound really difficult when you're someone whose mind constantly drifts. That's why I want to explain the mechanics of why this works. What we found working with people is that completing tasks creates a domino effect. The first task you complete is genuinely hard. You have to fight through all that mental clutter and fragmentation. You have to resist the urge to switch when you get tired. You have to push through to actually finish something. But here's the magic: the moment you complete that first task, something shifts. Task is no longer being tracked by your background mental processes. You've freed up cognitive resources. The second task becomes noticeably easier. The third task becomes easier still. The fourth task flows more smoothly. Each completed task removes a weight you've been carrying. By the time you've completed 2 or 3 tasks, you often find yourself in a completely different mental state. Suddenly, everything feels manageable. Work that seemed impossible an hour ago now feels straightforward. The momentum builds on itself. The second key principle is to avoid multitasking as much as you possibly can. I know. We live in a world that seems designed to make us multitask. Your job probably involves constant interruptions. You get notifications from 10 different apps. There are Slack messages, emails, text messages, phone calls, all demanding your attention throughout the day. These distractions are everywhere, and they're often not entirely under your control. Within whatever constraints you have, you want to minimize multitasking as much as possible. You want to protect blocks of time where you focus on moving one thing to completion. Turn off notifications if you can. Close extra browser tabs. Put your phone in another room. Do whatever you need to do to reduce the constant switching. And here's the third principle, which might sound contradictory to everything about productivity. If you want to be truly productive, you need to deliberately dedicate time to being unproductive. You need to give yourself time when you're not trying to accomplish external tasks at all. Let me explain why this matters so much. You have one brain. That's it. The same brain that's trying to complete your work projects is also the brain that's trying to solve your relationship problems. It's trying to process your feelings about your career. It's trying to deal with your anxieties about the future. It's trying to figure out your friendships. It's trying to make sense of world events that worry you. It's trying to work through family conflicts. One brain managing everything. Here's what tends to happen in modern life. When you have downtime, let's say a weekend, you don't actually give your brain space to process all that personal material. Instead, you immediately fill that space with highly distracting, highly absorbing, highly stimulating activities. You scroll through social media for hours. You play video games that demand intense focus. You binge watch shows that are emotionally gripping. You keep your mind constantly occupied with external stimulation. And here's what's so interesting about this patterns. When you spend your weekends this way, you rarely experience mental wandering because you're so heavily stimulated. Your mind never gets the chance to drift into that processing mode. But then Monday comes. You sit down to work. And your brain, which has been denied the opportunity to process all that background material, immediately starts trying to do it. Your mind wanders constantly because you haven't given it any other opportunity to work on all those unresolved issues. You've been keeping it so busy with external stimulation that it couldn't do its necessary internal processing work. Now it hijacks your work time to finally deal with all that accumulated emotional and psychological material. The solution is to actually build in time where you let your mind wander productively. You can go back to what those original researchers discovered and spend time in nature. Go for a long walk without your phone, by a river or in a park, and just let your mind go where it wants to go. You don't have to go into nature specifically, although that does seem to work particularly well for most people. The key is giving yourself time that's free from constant stimulation, when your mind can drift and process and work through things at its own pace. Some people find that taking a long shower works. People like to sit with a cup of coffee or tea and just stare out the window. Some people do gentle, repetitive activities like folding laundry or washing dishes, activities that don't require much focused attention. When you build this unproductive time into your schedule, something remarkable happens. Your mind gets to process all that personal and emotional material during time you've designated for it. It works through the relationship concerns, the career anxieties, the social conflicts, all of it. Then, when you sit down to work, your mind is actually available for work. It's not constantly trying to redirect your attention to unresolved personal issues because those issues have had time and space to be processed. Your mental wandering during work time decreases dramatically because the wandering has happened when you gave it permission to happen. Let me give you a concrete example of how this played out with the person I was working with. Remember, they were dealing with this separation from their partner, and that unresolved situation was constantly pulling at their attention. We started by acknowledging that their brain needed time to process this major life event. We actually scheduled time, specific blocks in their calendar, where their only job was to think about the relationship. Not to decide anything necessarily, not to take any action, but just to let their mind work on it. Sometimes they would go for a walk. They would sit in a coffee shop with a journal. Sometimes they would just sit quietly at home. The key was that during this time, they weren't trying to distract themselves. They weren't trying to force their mind to focus on something else. They were giving their brain explicit permission to wander and process. At the same time, we worked on task completion. When they sat down to work, they would pick one task, ideally something that could be completed in a single work session, or at most a couple of sessions. They would commit to finishing that task before moving to anything else. No switching to check email. No starting a different project when they hit a difficult part. Just pushing through to completion on one thing. The first day they tried this, it was hard, really hard. Their mind still wandered. They still felt the pull to switch tasks. They kept bringing their attention back, and they managed to complete one task. Just one. But that one completed task made a difference. The next day, completing the first task was still challenging, but slightly less so. And once they got that first completion, the second task flowed more easily. Within about a week of consistently applying these principles, finishing one thing before starting another, and giving themselves dedicated time for mental wandering outside of work hours, they noticed a dramatic shift. They were getting more done in a single focused hour than they used to get done in an entire day of fragmented effort. Their mind wasn't constantly pulling them away from work because it had other designated times to process personal material. And each completed task freed up mental resources, making the next task easier. The improvement in their attention wasn't because we increased medication, although that remained part of the picture. The improvement came from working with how attention actually functions rather than fighting against it. We stopped treating mental wandering as the enemy and started treating it as a signal that their brain had processing work to do. We gave that processing work appropriate time and space. And we stopped the counterproductive pattern of starting lots of things and finishing nothing. Now, I want to be clear about something. This approach requires some self-awareness awareness and experimentation. You need to figure out what kind of unstructured time works best for you. Some people really do need to get out into nature. Being around trees and water and open seems to facilitate the right kind of mental state for them. Other people do their best processing in a cozy indoor space with a warm drink. Some people need silence. People find that gentle background noise, like rain sounds or quiet instrumental music, helps their mind settle into a wandering state. You have to experiment and find what works similarly. You need to figure out how much of this processing time you need. If you're going through a particularly difficult period in your life, if there's a lot of emotional material you're dealing with, you might need an hour or more several times a week. If things are relatively stable and calm, you might find that 20 minutes a day is enough. The key is paying attention to your own patterns. If you notice that your mind is constantly wandering during work time, that's a signal that you probably need more dedicated processing time. If you find that your mind stays fairly focused during work, then you're probably giving it enough space to process elsewhere. You also need to think about what tasks are on your mental tracking list. Sometimes we're not even fully aware of everything our brain is trying to keep track of. A helpful exercise is to do a complete brain dump. Sit down with paper or a computer and write out absolutely everything that's on your mind. Work tasks, personal tasks, decisions you need to make, problems you need to solve, conversations you need to have, concerns you're carrying. All of it. Just get it all out of your head and onto paper. You'll probably be surprised by how much is actually in there. Once you have this external list, you can start making decisions about each item. Some things need to be acted on and completed. Those go on your task list, and you commit to actually finishing them one by one. Things you've been carrying around but don't actually need to do anything about right now. Maybe they're things you're waiting on someone else for, or maybe they're concerns about situations you can't control. For those items, you can consciously decide to let them go for now or set a specific time when you'll revisit them. The act of making these conscious decisions about what's on your mental plate helps reduce the cognitive load. Another important aspect of this approach is learning to distinguish between productive mental wandering and rumination. Productive wandering is when your mind is actually working through something, when you're processing emotions, gaining new perspectives, or working toward resolution on an issue. Rumination is when your mind goes in circles over the same thoughts without making progress, often with a lot of harsh self-judgment or catastrophizing. If you notice your mental wandering has turned into rumination, that's when you might need additional support. Talking to a friend, working with a counselor, journaling about the issue can help break the rumination cycle and move toward actual processing. I also want to address the reality that many of you have jobs or situations where you genuinely can't control when interruptions happen. Maybe you're in customer service and you have to respond when someone needs help. Maybe you're a parent and kids need attention unpredictably throughout the day. Maybe your boss has a habit of dropping urgent requests on you without warning. In these situations, you have to work within the constraints you have. The principle of task completion still applies, but you might need to think about it differently. Maybe instead of completing a huge project in one sitting, identify smaller chunks that can be completed even with interruptions. Maybe you protect 1 hour early in the morning or late at night when interruptions are less likely. Maybe you communicate boundaries where possible, letting people know you need focused time. The key is making conscious choices about how you direct your attention rather than just reacting constantly. Even small moves toward more intentional focus and task completion can make a significant difference. And remember, the goal isn't perfection. You're not trying to never have your mind wander during work time. That's not realistic and probably not even desirable. The goal is to reduce unhelpful wandering by giving your brain what it needs, both in terms of cognitive recovery time and emotional processing time. Also talk about how this connects to energy management throughout the day. Your cognitive capacity isn't constant from morning to night. Most people have periods when their mental energy is higher and periods when it's lower. For many people, focus is strongest in the morning, declines after lunch, and may pick up again in early evening, though this varies individually. If you can try to schedule your most demanding tasks, the ones that require the most sustained focus during your high energy periods. Save more routine tasks, things that don't require as much mental firepower, for your lower energy times. And importantly, recognize that after you've completed a cognitively demanding task, your brain needs a few minutes to recover before diving into the next one. Those few minutes of mental wandering aren't wasted time. They're necessary recovery that allows you to approach the next task with restored capacity. Physical factors also play a huge role in your ability to focus. If you're not sleeping enough, if you're dehydrated, if your blood sugar is crashing because you haven't eaten properly, your brain won't have the resources it needs to sustain attention. These aren't just nice to have extras. They're fundamental requirements for cognitive function. Make sure you're taking care of the physical foundation that your brain depends on. Get enough sleep, genuinely enough, not just the minimum you can scrape by on. Drink water throughout the day. Eat regular meals that include protein and complex carbohydrates to keep your blood sugar stable. Move your body regularly. All of these physical factors directly impact your ability to focus and your tendency to experience mental wandering. There's also something to be said about the role of interest and meaning in sustaining attention. It's much easier to focus on tasks that genuinely interest you or that feel meaningful and connected to your larger goals. When you're working on something that feels pointless or boring, your mind will naturally try to escape to something more engaging. If you find yourself constantly struggling to focus on your work, it might be worth examining whether the work itself is aligned with what matters to you. Sometimes the attention problem isn't really about attention at all. It's about being in a situation that doesn't fit you. That's a much bigger and more complex issue to address, but it's worth considering. Seen people make remarkable transformations in their productivity and their quality of life by implementing these principles. People who spent years believing they were fundamentally broken or lazy or undisciplined discovered that they weren't any of those things. They were just working against their brain's natural functioning rather than with it. Once they understood the underlying mechanisms, they stopped fighting mental wandering and started working with it strategically. Everything changed. Tasks that used to take hours of fragmented effort got completed in focused sessions. Work that used to drain them and leave them exhausted became more manageable. They had more energy left over for their personal lives, for relationships and hobbies and rest. The person I told you about at the beginning, the one whose attention seemed to be getting worse, made significant progress with this approach. Their attention difficulties didn't completely disappear. Remember, there was an underlying neurodevelopmental factor that was always going to be part of the picture. The progressive worsening stopped and even reversed. They got back to a level of functioning that felt manageable and sustainable. More importantly, they gained understanding and tools that allowed them to work effectively with their brain rather than constantly fighting it. They learned to read the signals their brain was sending through mental wandering. They learned to give their brain what it needed in terms of processing time. They learned to structure their work around completion rather than just getting started. These insights and skills became part of how they approached life. And here's what I hope you take away from all of this. If you struggle with your mind wandering, if you spend hours working without getting much done, if you feel like your attention is getting worse, you're not broken. Your brain is functioning exactly as it's designed to function. It's trying to manage cognitive resources and process emotional material. The solution isn't to fight harder or to blame yourself more or to try to force yourself into sustained focus through sheer willpower. The solution is to understand what your brain is trying to do and to work with those natural processes. Give your brain dedicated time to wander and process. Focus on completing tasks rather than just starting them. Minimize multitasking where possible. Take care of the physical foundation that supports cognitive function. These aren't complicated tricks. They're straightforward principles based on how attention actually works. Implementing them consistently can completely transform your relationship with focus and productivity. You can move from that exhausting state of constant fragmentation to a much more sustainable and effective way of working. Your brain is trying to help you. Let it.